AWS, and I think this can be said for all of the hyperscalers, their biggest concern is how do I drive infrastructure consumption? They
Right.
want
Spin the
these
meter.
AI workloads to be running on their infrastructure. So that is their focus for monetizing the Gen AI opportunity. They have all these platform offerings too, which are going to be revenue generators, but at the end of the day, the IaaS opportunity is really the core.
Welcome to TBR Talks, decoding strategies and ecosystems of the globe's top tech firms, where we talk business model disruption in the broad technology ecosystem, from management consultancies to systems integrators, hyperscalers to independent software vendors, telecom operators to network and infrastructure vendors, and chip manufacturers to value-added resellers. We'll be answering some of the key intelligence questions we've heard from executives and business unit leaders among the leading professional services, IT, and telecom vendors. I'm Patrick Heffernan, Principal Analyst, and today we'll be talking about TBR's new AI and GenAI technology market landscape with Alex Demeule, Analyst for TBR's Cloud and Software Practice. Alex, welcome back. This is the second time you've been on this episode, and now the first time, though, I think you're bringing something brand new, this new piece of research. So what exactly is it, and what were some of the most important things you discovered in doing the research to produce the report?
Yeah, great to be here. I think that, when we started to work on this report, we were looking at this whole new area of the technology landscape and looking at the Gen AI value chain specifically. And we recognized that we had a bit of a hole looking at kind of the very beginning, the large language model developers, the foundation model developers that are really at the cutting edge of the innovation that is really driving so much of the conversation these days. So we really wanted to start to lay a foundation for, what is going on with these foundation model developers? What are they doing? Who are they working with? And what sort of agreements are they putting in place to make sure that they're able to get value from the innovation that they're driving today?
And is your sense that the change has been that there have been a number of these that have popped up in the last couple of years, or is the change more that these companies have been around for a little while? They're not like brand new startups. They've been around. It's just with the sort of massive amount of hype and ChatGPT and induced hype around Gen AI that has sparked this new interest.
Yeah, they've been around for years, right? It's just more that they've been kind of sort of under the cover of, not necessarily in a stealth mode per se, given that they all had names, but more that they were sort of working to build what would go on to be their revenue generators. And they weren't necessarily generating the amount of revenue that they're starting to see today already. At this point, the phrase unicorn is a great way to describe practically all of them. And that was, we were thinking about calling it the Gen AI unicorn market landscape at first. But, when we start talking about companies like Meta, which is a company covered in here, given that it's the big developer for the open source Llama 3 model and the Llama family of large language models, didn't really fit perfectly. So
Llamas and unicorns don't go
llamas and
together.
unicorns, exactly. So yeah, these are all privately held organizations that, still have a startup feel because they're very high, fast growth, but have really quickly become established players in the market.
So I got a couple questions I want to get to. One, you mentioned the revenue. I want to talk about where the money's actually coming from. Two, you just mentioned that they're privately held, and I want to talk to you about how you get information about them, given they're privately held. But let's start with, broadly, who are the vendors that are in this? Because it's not just the large language model companies. Who else are you talking about in this market landscape?
Yeah, absolutely. I think when we went with this market landscape, TBR has the AI and Gen AI market landscape broadly, which really gets into the professional services and the hyperscaler and SaaS, how all those players are playing in the Gen AI value chain. So we did really want to go upstream towards the foundation model developers broadly. But one of the unique names that we talk about, Hugging Face, they aren't necessarily a foundation model developer themselves, but they are a more of an open source catalog of foundation models. So they have really kind of built a niche in that area, kind of a GitHub for generative AI, if you will. So that is another vendor that is covered in this report. So, really trying to look at who is providing and who is creating access to these foundation models.
That makes sense because I guess if you're talking about unicorns and it's such a fast moving industry, you're not going to be able to make sort of that benchmark comparison that
Hmm.
we also do at TBR, but it's more the landscape of what's out there. So before we get to the revenue, the challenge of going after and understanding what privately held companies are doing,
Hmm.
were some parts of TBR were really good at it. Other parts of TBR we shy away from it. Were you worried at all going into this research that you weren't going to be able to find enough information, or was there a lot out there that you were able to pull together? Did you have to do independent, in-depth interviews? Did you need to do primary collection? Like, how did you make sure that you understood what was happening in these privately held companies?
Sure. Given that they're privately held, we didn't want to go very deep into the financials of these companies because, these are, for the most part, companies that aren't reporting financials ever. There's a couple instances where, CEOs will come out and talk about where revenue is. And specifically, OpenAI has touched upon that. Anthropic has touched upon that and given forward guidance. And both of those are included in this report. But outside of those, independent moments where CEOs are just bragging about their run rate revenue, we really didn't venture too deeply because that is something that is still, you know, really hard to suss out because these are such early stage companies. Valuation metrics, we do include those a bit more, and that's a little bit more reported on. A lot of these companies are doing a lot of fundraising, and when those fundraisings happen, it's usually a pretty publicly available number. So we did try to, bring that together for the reader to provide a little bit of comparison between, where OpenAI is at north of like 80 billion to where Anthropic is at a bit less. And so, being very, transparent and kind of not trying to go too deep into the financials where it's a little bit hard to, have a clear perspective. I think with some of the other stuff, really focusing on primary research, there's a lot of information out there around the developments that these companies are doing. There's such a big spotlight on them today that finding primary information isn't super difficult.
Hmm.
We definitely leverage some customer research that we have done as part of the cloud practices, like broader customer research reporting. So was able to leverage a lot of that. That went into a bit more with, customer use of services like the Azure OpenAI service or Amazon Bedrock. So primary research through that customer research that we do generally and what we can see out in the market.
Yeah, and it's cloudy, it's messy, it's challenging, but it sounds like you were able to gather enough. And when you mentioned the CEOs sort of can't help themselves in talking about what their
Mm.
revenue is, but that does raise the question because you mentioned funding as well. So a lot of these companies are venture capital backed. They're out there raising money. How are they actually generating revenue, and what's your take on the long term of where the revenue streams are actually going to come from?
Yeah, this was definitely something that I spent a lot of time trying to figure out. And, I think on a individual level, individual agreement level, it's hard to place a pin in it specifically. There are instances that we're able to find and source credible information on specific agreements, such as AWS and Anthropic. And, when we went into the information streams, it's really a revenue sharing agreement that
Mm.
is in place between the companies. AWS, and I think this can be said for all of the hyperscalers, their biggest concern is how do I drive infrastructure consumption? They
Right.
want
Spin the
these
meter.
AI workloads to be running on their infrastructure. So that is their focus for monetizing the Gen AI opportunity. They have all these platform offerings too, which are going to be revenue generators, but at the end of the day, the IaaS opportunity is really the core. So, with that being the core, they are going to be offering revenue sharing agreements. And so I think of this kind of as how a more traditional application running on AWS infrastructure, how that revenue sharing
Mm.
agreement would be. We talk about cloud marketplaces a lot, and the AWS cloud marketplace, you would be earning a listing fee on the application. And that is sort of what the agreement has been established here as well, where AWS is able to get the consumption revenue on their infrastructure and charging the customer for that, but then a separate build item listing fee that is going straight to Anthropic, the model
Hmm.
developer.
Okay. Yeah. So in some ways, the revenue part of it, at least for the hyperscalers, hasn't really changed. And so for the companies we're talking about in this landscape, it's really finding their way to monetize their relationship with everyone else in the ecosystem.
Right. Yeah, exactly. They are bringing their innovation and they are placing it in the hands of all the other value adding players in
Right.
that Gen A supply chain and making sure that they get their cut
Right.
as those providers use their technology.
Right. They got to get their cut. So last question. I know at the end of the report, you've got a whole section on alliances. And in that section, all of the alliances that you detail are two company alliances, just a two-party alliances. Are you seeing, or do you think we'll see more three, four, five-party alliances? Sort of what we talk about in other parts of TBR, sort of like super groups, where companies that span a chunk of the ecosystem coming together to go to market together to form sort of a consortium around a particular kind of offering or a particular kind of client. Are we gonna see that too, or no?
I do think so. I think that these cloud ecosystems that already exist, I think that the model vendors are going to be kind of brought into those existing engagements so that they can bring, their model development to these existing ecosystems. I think that one of the biggest challenges right now is making sure generative AI is useful and productive,
Mm.
and use case exploration and use case implementation is a big part of that. And a lot of different members have to come together in order to make that happen. We talk about the management consultancies and their ability to make generative AI or, really lead a lot of this domain knowledge that is important for the use case discovery. So it's about bringing together, the hyperscaler that has the infrastructure, the management consultancy or the GSI with the domain knowledge.
Right.
And those are typically the two parties that already have that existing relationship. But then, rope the model developer into that so that they are able to, start building these models around the use case. Something that we talked about a bit in the model is this emergence of small language models
Mhm.
and hybrid architecture, large language models. And I think that a big part of how that development will move forward will be use case centric. So, how are we developing small language models and training small language models around the use case? And that's a conversation there where the management consulting, GSI, the hyperscaler, and the foundation model developer all need to come together.
Right. Those small large language models and the use cases around them, there that can make sense to anyone who's not a data scientist or an engineer. And I mean, honestly, most of us don't understand the
Right.
science and the math behind the models. We don't need to understand the science and the math behind the models. We need to understand, how is it actually going to help my business? How is it going to make things better for me? So,
And you need to know the cost, that's
and the cost.
the small language
True.
model, that's the thing that I think that even us as business people can start to understand is the cost of training a small language model versus the cost of training a large language model. Reading an article yesterday, and this was brought up on the AWS earnings call just this past week, the cost of developing the next generation of large language models is just going to keep going up and up
Mm.
exponentially from projecting. I think the Anthropic CEO is projecting $1 billion for Claude 4, 10 billion for Claude 5. So as the parameter counts get higher, there's this diminishing returns for performance, and we need to start to look at performance differently. And that cost equation is a big part of that.
And that's the exact opposite of the hype of last year, where it was like this Gen AI is gonna cut costs everywhere. It's going to make things so much easier. And now you're basically saying, yeah, the reality is the bill's got to come, and that bill's going to get larger as we go through time. So this report, market landscape, annual, semi-annual?
Semi-annual.
Semi-annual. So we'll chat again in the fall. We'll have this not the exact same conversation, but we'll revisit this landscape in the fall and we'll chat then. Excellent. Thank you, Alex.
Look forward to it. Thanks, Patrick.
All right, so next week I'll be speaking with Chris Antlitz about his upcoming telecom artificial intelligence research. And don't forget to send us your key intelligence questions on business strategy, ecosystems, and management through the form in the show notes below. And visit tbri.com to learn how we help tech companies large and small answer these questions with the research, data, and analysis my guests like Alex bring to this conversation every week. Once again, I'm your host, Patrick Heffernan, Principal Analyst at TBR. Thanks for joining us and see you next week.